My name is Michael Denuzzo, and I'm working on Peachtree Case A. Question 1. Why are the T-bond returns in Table 1 shown to be independent of the state of the economy? They are independent of the state of the economy because the government will typically raise taxes to pay for the debt it incurs, and the debt is virtually risk-free of default, which concerns the second question, which asks if T-bonds are risk-free. Most people do think of T-bonds as being completely risk-free. However, they technically are not 100% risk-free. More so, I like to call them virtually risk-free. Treasury yields depend on three components, which is the real rate, the expected future inflation, and the interest rate risk premium. Second question asks to calculate the expected rate of return on each of the four alternatives listed in Table 1. I found the T-bond return to be 8%, the return on TACO to be 13.5%, Gold Hill's return 8.8%, and the S&P 500 fund produced a return of 15%. So as you can see, the S&P 500 fund produced the biggest return out of all four investments. Based solely on expected returns, which of the potential investments appears best? That would of course be the S&P 500 fund, and I would invest in the T-bond lastly because it produces, as you can see, the smallest return. Question 3 asked me to calculate the standard deviations and coefficients of variation of returns for the four alternatives. The T-bond produced 0 standard deviation, 0 coefficient of variation. TECO produced 11.7% standard deviation and 0.87 coefficient of variation. Gold Hill produced a standard deviation of 13.7% and a 1.56 coefficient of variation. The standard deviation of the S&P 500 fund was 16.4%, while the coefficient of variation was 1.09. Following those numbers, question A asked, what type of risk do these statistics measure? The standard deviation and coefficient of variation are common measures of variability or dispersion. Therefore, they are appropriate measures of risk for stocks. Question 3b asks, is the standard deviation or the coefficient of variation the better measure? I feel since the coefficient of variation incorporates the standard deviation as a portion of the expected return, I believe that it produces a better measure, since the standard deviation alone does not actually incorporate the expected return with it as well. So all in all, the coefficient of variation gives the user more information. C asks, how do the alternatives compare when risk is considered? As you can see in the table, the figures are laid out there. Now question 4 asks us to assume that an investor forms a stock portfolio by investing $10,000 in Gold Hill and $10,000 in TECO. Therefore, that would be an even 50% split with both of the companies in this single portfolio. We were asked what would be the portfolio's expected rate of return, standard deviation, and coefficient of variation of this portfolio. I found the expected rate of return to be for the portfolio to be 11.15% and the coefficient of variation to be 0.23. B asks, how does this compare with values for the individual stocks? Well, The return is the average of all the stocks in the portfolio, since there is an equal proportion of investment in both companies. What characteristic of the two investments makes risk reduction possible? If both investments were to be negatively correlated, the risk in the portfolio would be significantly reduced. This means that one of the companies, let's assume TECO, would have a beta of 1, while Gold Hill would simultaneously hold a beta of -1. And this way, one company's stock would be doing well while the market is doing well, while the other would be doing bad when the market's doing well, and vice versa. Question D asks us what I think would happen to the portfolio's expected rate of return and standard deviation if the portfolio contains 75% Gold Hill and if it contained 75% TECO. And as you can see, the standard deviation are very close if TECO held 75% or 25%, and so are the expected rates of return. Question 5 asks us to consider a portfolio consisting of $10,000 in TECO and $10,000 in the S&P 500 fund. So again, that's a 50-50 split in the portfolio. And it asks if this portfolio would have the same risk-reducing effect as the Gold Hill TECO portfolio considered in question 4. I found that this portfolio with the S&P 500 fund carries more risk than the one of Gold Hill and TECO. And this is because Gold Hill and TECO are less risky together, since their returns differ greatly from one another. So, for example, when Gold Hill in an above average state of the economy has a return of 25%, TECO has a return of -3%. So, like I said earlier, if the market's doing well, then half of your portfolio will be doing good, while the other half is doing mediocre, which evens the risk and the return out. Question 6 asks us to assume an investor starts with a portfolio consisting of one random stock. So what would happen to the portfolio's risk if more and more randomly selected stocks were added? If that happened, there would be a chance of many different outcomes occurring, since we don't know exactly which stock will be put into the portfolio. If the investor was lucky, the stocks would all be well diversified and he or she would be free of much risk. However, if he or she is not lucky, the portfolio may instead be filled with positively correlated stocks, which would increase the risk in the investor's portfolio. What are some of the implications for investors? Well, a good investor will typically hold a portfolio that is well diversified, of course. Adding a great stock to one investor's portfolio may not produce the same effect as adding that same stock to another investor's portfolio, and that's because portfolios perform best from a certain mixture or variety of stocks in it instead of just having one single winning stock in a portfolio. It's more about the interaction of the stocks in a portfolio which truly matters. C asks if portfolio effects impact the way investors should think about the riskiness of individual securities. And that is a big yes. Each and every investor should understand the way any given stock will affect his or her portfolio. Investors should always be thinking of the riskiness of individual securities, as one may be more risky to an investor's portfolio than adding that same investment to somebody else's portfolio. D asks us, would I expect this to affect companies' cost of capital? And this definitely would affect companies' cost of capital, because cost of capital will be higher for companies that do not diversify their portfolios well. By reducing risk as much as possible, a company can reduce their cost of capital. E asks us to explain the differences between total risk, diversifiable, which is company-specific risk, and market risk. Well, the equation goes total risk equals the combination of diversifiable risk and market risk. So together, diversifiable and market risk make up total risk. F asks to assume that I chose to hold a single stock portfolio, and should I expect to be compensated for all of the risk that I bear? And I feel that nobody should expect to be compensated for the risk that they bear, and that is why stocks are risky, because there is a risk that you may not receive a return or any of the money that you originally invested into a stock. But like I said earlier, a good investor will acquire a diversified portfolio so that he or she will always be in a good position even when the stock market is heavily impacted. The graph below indicates the slope coefficient of each line. Based on the security market line, what is the required rate of return on TECO stock while using Value Line's beta estimate of 0.6 as reported in Figure 1? I found the required rate of return for TECO to be 12.2%. Question 9 asks what would happen to TECO's required rate of return if inflation expectations increased by 3 percentage points above the estimate embedded in the 8% risk-free rate. Then in that case, the risk-free rate and the market rate would also increase by 3%. Now if we go back to the original inflation estimate and indicate what would happen to TECO's required rate of return if investors' risk aversion increased so that the market risk premium rose from 7 to 8%. Well, when investors' risk aversion increases, so must the required rate of return for any given investment, because they are not so much ready to handle risks, so they want a rate of return that would very much satisfy them in their portfolio. Therefore, the required rate of return for TECO in this case would be 12.8%. Now if we go back to the original conditions and assume that TECO's beta rose from 0.6 to 1, this effect would increase the required rate of return all the way up to 15%. Question 10 asks us to assume TECO's long-term debt ratio decreased during the period of 1992 through 2002. Further, suppose this ratio was projected to continue decreasing in 1993 and beyond. What impact would this have on TECO's riskiness, hence on its beta and required rate of return? In this case, upon TECO's debt ratio decreasing, the riskiness of the company would also decrease, which is probably a good thing for this company. TECO's beta would also be lower as a result of a declining debt ratio. That is because people would consider investing in this company less risky since they own less debt. And finally, its required rate of return would most likely be lower since investors aren't investing into something too risky, so they don't need a higher rate of return. And this is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.